August 8th, 1944, near Falaise, Normandy. The dawn was supposed to bring relief. Instead, it brought silence, the kind that presses against the skin like a warning. Three Allied units sat trapped in a shallow basin east of Falaise, surrounded on three sides by German armor. The night before, rain had turned the fields to a slow, sticky mire. Now, as the first light broke through the fog, their own smoke rounds had drifted the wrong way, carried by the shifting wind toward friendly lines. Major Charles H. Wilson, commander of an exhausted tank company, crouched beside a half-buried Sherman studying the haze. His crews were low on fuel, ammunition nearly gone, and the Luftwaffe had begun early reconnaissance flights. Escape seemed impossible. Then Wilson did something no manual had ever suggested. He ordered the engineers to reassemble the smoke dischargers backwards, so that when fired, the smoke would spread not outward, but back toward their own position. Men laughed, others stared, but in a few hours, that stupid order would save over 200 lives. By the summer of 1944, the Allied campaign in Western Europe had entered its most volatile phase. Operation Cobra had torn open the German front west of Saint-Lô, and the U.S. First and British Second Armies were pushing south and east, racing to encircle retreating Wehrmacht divisions. But victory was never clean. For every breakthrough, there were pockets, units stranded in valleys, fields and hedgerow country, cut off by shifting front lines and collapsing communication. The terrain of Normandy, picturesque in peace, was a nightmare for war. Tall hedgerows carved the countryside into green labyrinths, breaking visibility and forcing tank columns into narrow, ambush-prone lanes. Fields that looked open from the air became death traps when artillery and anti-tank guns had overlapping fields of fire. German defenders, veterans of the Eastern Front, knew how to exploit every fold in the ground. The Allies advanced with determination, but not without missteps. Coordination between British, Canadian, and American forces was still developing, and the speed of the German counteractions often left spearhead units dangerously exposed. In early August, elements of the 2nd Canadian Corps and American armored formations found themselves overextended in the Falaise region. The enemy, though battered, was still disciplined, especially remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the 2nd Panzer Division, which sought to close the emerging Allied pocket before it fully formed. In this shifting chaos, Major Charles H. Wilson's tank company operated near the small village of Troon. His orders were to support infantry pushing through the southern approach, securing the road network to prevent German escape toward the Seine. It was a straightforward assignment until the counterattack came. On August 7th, German units launched a sudden assault from Hill 195, using a dense morning fog to conceal movement. The attack split Allied formations and cut several supply lines. Radio communication crackled, then died completely. Wilson's company, along with 2 infantry detachments, was suddenly cut off, isolated in a shallow depression surrounded by German armor and artillery. For most soldiers, such moments blurred into survival instinct. Dig in, hold the line, hope for air cover. But the weather, once again, turned against them. The same fog that had masked the German approach now neutralized Allied air support. By evening, visibility dropped below 50 meters. The units were trapped in a natural bowl, their smoke rounds drifting unpredictably, often back toward friendly positions due to the valley's strange air currents. Major Wilson, a practical man from Ohio with a background in engineering, had long complained about the Sherman's smoke discharger setup. Designed to project outward at fixed angles, it offered cover only in specific directions, a flaw in uneven terrain. He had once jokingly suggested that firing smoke backwards could create a dome effect around the tank. His crew laughed then. They would laugh again the next morning, but for very different reasons. As the night deepened, the situation worsened. German mortars probed their perimeter, artillery landed closer each hour, and ammunition boxes grew lighter. The only thing thicker than the fear was the mist itself. Wilson crawled along the mud, inspecting disabled tanks, marking positions, and thinking about the strange wind that seemed to pull every smoke plume the wrong way. He realized something few others noticed. The valley's microclimate, the same quirk that doomed their visibility, could also be used to their advantage. If they could saturate the air with dense smoke that moved backward into their own lines, the valley could become a white curtain, blinding both attacker and defender alike. It was risky, untested, and technically foolish. But without fuel or reinforcements, risk was all that remained. By dawn, Wilson would quietly issue his most unconventional order: to reverse the smoke dischargers on every functioning tank. Mechanics argued, gunners protested, and some openly mocked the plan. But the major's steady tone and unshakable calm carried through the noise. "If we can't outrun them," he said, "we'll outthink them." And with that, the idea of the backward smoke device began to take shape. Born not from theory, but from desperation, Major Charles H. Wilson had never been the kind of officer who inspired awe. He was quiet, methodical, and slightly eccentric in his technical habits. Before the war, he had worked as a maintenance engineer for a locomotive company in Cleveland, designing exhaust systems for steam engines. When he enlisted in 1941, his attention to mechanical detail made him an outlier among field commanders who often preferred boldness over tinkering. Yet that mechanical curiosity, the same trait his peers found odd, would soon become his greatest asset. By August 1944, Wilson's company was part of the 2nd Armored Division's forward detachment, equipped with a mix of M4 Shermans and M5 Stuarts. Their orders were simple but critical: secure the crossroads near Troon to choke German retreat routes. But as the front shifted rapidly, the detachment became misaligned with the main advance, leaving it dangerously exposed to flanking attacks. The encirclement developed not as a single catastrophic event, but as a series of small errors. Supply convoys missed their routes, artillery support repositioned too far north, and reconnaissance reports failed to register new German movements. The Wehrmacht, operating with ruthless efficiency even in retreat, exploited every Allied gap. Within 48 hours, Wilson's position became a pocket. One small cluster of tanks, infantry, and engineers surrounded by enemy armor and observers. For the men on the ground, isolation changed everything. The sound of Allied aircraft became distant. The comfort of command updates vanished. Rations dwindled. Artillery shells began arriving with unnerving precision. The valley's geography made escape nearly impossible. Every exit route crossed open ground under direct observation by German gunners perched on the surrounding ridges. Even minor movement drew immediate fire. Wilson's leadership shifted from formal command to survival coordination. He ordered radio repairs, reorganized defensive positions, and personally inspected the smoke launchers on each tank. The dischargers, small steel cylinders mounted at the turret's edge, were designed to fire smoke grenades outward in a fan pattern. But in a valley shaped like a bowl, those grenades either drifted uselessly upward or rolled back down, revealing positions instead of concealing them. During a tense evening meeting with his platoon leaders, one young lieutenant joked that perhaps they should fire the smoke backwards. Laughter followed, brief, brittle, masking the fatigue of men who had fought too long without rest. But Wilson didn't laugh. Instead, he stared at the map, tracing wind direction with his finger. The idea, absurd as it sounded, matched the environmental pattern he had observed for days. He left the shelter, walked to a nearby tank, and examined the launchers again. With some mechanical adjustment, loosening brackets, rotating mounts, and rerouting the ignition wires, it might actually work. It would mean the smoke grenades fired slightly downward and back toward the tank, enveloping it in a close shroud. The concept was counterintuitive, even dangerous, since it could obscure visibility for his own crews. But Wilson understood something few others did. In dense smoke, the Germans' superior optical range would be neutralized. If the Allied tanks disappeared first, it could break the enemy's targeting rhythm long enough to open a path of retreat. That night, under flickering lanterns, the engineers began the modifications. Each launcher was adjusted by hand, guided by Wilson's sketches in a small oil-stained notebook. Grease-covered fingers, bolts clinked in the mud, and the occasional whistle of distant artillery punctuated the work. The soldiers worked in near silence, every sound dampened by fog. Not everyone believed it would help. Some thought the plan reckless, that they'd choke themselves in their own smoke. Others whispered that the major was trying to give men false hope. But there was something steady in Wilson's demeanor, a quiet conviction that kept fear from spreading. He didn't promise victory. He only promised a chance. As the final adjustments were made, he gathered his officers and pointed east, toward the ridgeline that blocked their escape. "At first light," he said, "we fire every smoke canister we have. We make our own weather." The men nodded, uncertain but trusting. For the first time in days, there was direction. A plan that defied logic, yet gave purpose. What began as a joke around a muddy table would soon become one of the most unconventional tactical maneuvers of the Normandy campaign. In war, innovation often comes not from laboratories or headquarters, but from exhaustion, fear, and the need to survive another hour. The backwards smoke device was not the product of genius. It was the result of cornered men trying to outwit certain destruction. Among Wilson's crew, reactions to the order reflected the raw psychology of a trapped unit. Some men saw it as madness, tampering with standardized equipment in the middle of combat. Others, especially the engineers, recognized its crude logic. They had seen how smoke rounds behaved in valleys like this one. Unpredictable, swirling in reverse, often hugging the ground instead of rising. If they could amplify that effect, perhaps they could build a moving wall of blindness thick enough to break German line-of-sight targeting. The mechanics worked through the final hours of night. Private Sam Dorman, a 23-year-old welder from Pennsylvania, rewired several ignition triggers, running them through improvised junctions made from ration tin lids and stripped cable from a damaged radio. The air smelled of oil, mud, and burning insulation. Every sound had to be muffled, every hammer stroke wrapped in cloth to avoid detection. The crew's hands moved with a rhythm learned from desperation, not instruction. They had no technical manual, no blueprint, only a basic understanding of pressure angles and timing sequences. By the time the sky began to pale, all functioning Shermans had been modified. The launchers now pointed slightly downward and inward, aligned to spray smoke back toward the tank's hull and along the valley floor. From an engineering perspective, it was absurd. Conventional doctrine demanded smoke to screen forward advance, not blind one's own position. But Wilson's adjustment used the landscape itself as an ally. The valley's airflow, trapped between ridges, created a countercurrent that moved from east to west, directly against the direction of expected dispersion. That meant, when the smoke fired backwards, it wouldn't obscure their own retreat, but rather wrap around the enemy's observation posts, blurring their silhouettes and optics. For Wilson, this wasn't a gamble in theory. It was a gamble in timing. Smoke could only last minutes before thinning. His plan relied on synchronizing every launcher to fire simultaneously, saturating the air thick enough to distort depth and direction. Once the screen held, the tanks and infantry would move in tight formation toward the narrow corridor between the German lines, a path Wilson had scouted earlier by compass and instinct. The night before the maneuver, morale shifted from dread to fragile purpose. Men began checking weapons, tightening gear, whispering quiet jokes, the kind soldiers tell when hope feels dangerous to acknowledge. "Backward smoke," they said, half mocking, half praying. Some began calling the setup Wilson's Chimney, a dark bit of humor masking tension. But even amid the unease, something changed. Wilson's calmness, his refusal to panic or retreat into despair, gave the men a renewed sense of control. In war, confidence is contagious. A leader who appears to understand chaos can make others believe that order still exists within it. There was also an unspoken bond forming between man and machine. The tanks were no longer just vehicles. They had become shields, homes, and lifelines. Every clang of a wrench against steel felt like preparing a living being for survival. The crews painted crude smoke symbols on the turrets, small gestures of unity that replaced the insignia now caked with mud. To outsiders, it would have looked like madness. Soldiers preparing to flood their own position with chemical haze. But within the pocket, it felt like agency reclaimed. They weren't waiting for rescue anymore. They were preparing to make their own. At dawn, Wilson knelt beside the first tank and tested the trigger manually. The canisters hissed softly, white tendrils curling backward like ghosts. The smoke behaved exactly as he'd predicted, hugging the ground, drawn by the valley's cold air, forming a dense, rolling curtain that crept toward the German lines. The men stared in silence, watching the mist grow thicker. What had begun as laughter the night before now turned into awe. In less than 20 minutes, the valley would vanish beneath that man-made fog, and within it, 3 units would attempt an escape no one thought possible. For the German commanders watching from the ridgelines east of Troon, the morning began like any other engagement in Normandy: artillery adjustment, tank observation, and measured destruction of isolated Allied pockets. Through their binoculars, they saw the familiar outlines of Shermans in the valley below, motionless after 2 days of pressure. Everything suggested collapse. But just after 0600 hours, something unusual began to happen. A faint white haze appeared, not drifting outward as typical Allied smoke screens did, but rolling back toward the center of the valley, thickening unnaturally fast. At first, the observers assumed it was fuel fire or a misfire from retreating tanks. Yet, as the mist spread, it began to defy standard wind behavior, climbing upward along reverse currents and spilling over the German observation points. Within minutes, optics were useless. Rangefinders failed, spotters shouted conflicting bearings, and radio operators tried to recalibrate positions now swallowed in pale fog. From a tactical standpoint, the backward smoke achieved something extraordinary. It didn't just hide the Allied movement, it unbalanced the enemy's decision-making rhythm. German artillery officers, trained to adjust fire visually, suddenly lost their primary reference points. The valley floor became a blank slate, its landmarks erased. When they fired by grid coordinates alone, the shells landed on the ridges, dangerously close to their own infantry. Meanwhile, inside the smoke, Wilson's plan unfolded with machine-like precision. The tanks moved slowly, each crew maintaining visual contact with the next through signal lamps and sound. The dense vapor deadened noise, amplifying only the occasional metallic groan of treads or whispered commands over intercoms. Infantry moved between the vehicles, hands brushing hulls to keep direction. The valley that had once been a death trap now became a labyrinth of concealment. Wilson's timing had been perfect. As the fog thickened around the German side, the sun began to rise behind it, creating a blinding wall of reflected light. Through German optics, everything became a white glare, indistinguishable shapes flickering in distortion. One German officer, Oberleutnant Dieter Koch, later described it in his post-war interview. "We thought the smoke was a trick, something to mask an artillery strike. Then we realized we could no longer see our own forward troops. The valley disappeared, It was as if the enemy had folded the earth around themselves. This moment marked the inversion of tactical control. For 2 days, the Germans had dictated range and movement. Now, blinded and confused, they were reacting to an enemy they could no longer see or predict. Wilson had transformed the battlefield into a theater of illusion, where the senses of the attacker betrayed them more than the defender's courage. The brilliance of the device wasn't in its complexity, but in its simplicity. The reversed launchers exploited environmental physics, the cool valley air descending while warmer currents rose along the slopes, to sustain the smoke longer than standard screens. Where conventional tactics used smoke to advance, Wilson used it to disappear. The Germans' superior optics, once an advantage, now trapped them in uncertainty. The Allied troops themselves didn't fully understand what was happening. Many described the scene later as walking through clouds. Their visibility was nearly zero, but discipline and rehearsed formation kept them aligned. Each man trusted the rhythm of the tank engines, the vibration of the tracks, and the faint silhouette of the next figure in line. Inside one Sherman, a gunner named Ellis recalled seeing German tracers flash sporadically through the fog, like fireflies searching for something that wasn't there. The psychological effect was profound. Fear turned to focus. Panic replaced by determination. Above the chaos, Allied aircraft began reappearing as the morning haze lifted from higher altitudes. From their view, the valley below was hidden beneath a white sheet, with only faint movement along the northern edge. The pilots marked it as non-engagement zone, assuming it was already lost. Ironically, this misunderstanding helped the escape, drawing no German or Allied fire during the most critical hour of withdrawal. By the time the fog began thinning, the first units had already slipped through the narrow corridor toward friendly lines. What the Germans saw when the mist cleared wasn't a destroyed enemy, but an empty valley and the smoldering outlines of abandoned positions. And somewhere in that silence, realization dawned: the smoke had not failed. It had won. The first artillery shell landed just after 06:15. The earth jumped, and the valley answered with a low metallic echo as fragments tore through the mud. German batteries had recalibrated blindly, firing by assumption rather than sight. Wilson's radio operator caught half of a transmission before static swallowed it. The last known order from higher command: hold if you can. Reinforcements? Uncertain. To the men inside the pocket, uncertain meant forgotten. Wilson crouched behind his Sherman, listening not to explosions but to the rhythm between them. He had learned that German barrages often came in timed volleys, 90 seconds of fire, then silence to assess damage. It was in those silences that life could move forward. "Ready the smoke," he said calmly. Each tank's crew took position. Mechanics stood by the modified launchers, fuses cut to precise timing, every motion rehearsed under the faint blue dawn. The plan required absolute coordination, all launchers firing within 10 seconds to create a uniform veil. At exactly 06:20, Wilson gave the signal, a single red flare arcing upward and vanishing into the fog. A second later, the valley hissed to life. The sound was like hundreds of serpents exhaling. White clouds burst backward from each tank, expanding, colliding, and merging into a single flowing wall. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Visibility dropped to less than 3 meters. The ground disappeared beneath a crawling tide of smoke so dense it shimmered under the weak light. "Engines on!" Wilson ordered. The Shermans roared to life, their exhaust fumes mixing with the smoke, turning it into a swirling storm of gray. Infantrymen pressed against the hulls, hands resting on steel as their only guide. From the ridge lines, the Germans opened fire into the haze, their tracers slicing horizontally but hitting nothing. The backward smoke had created depth illusions, It made the tanks appear farther away or closer than they were, depending on angle. German gunners, deprived of visual anchors, began adjusting erratically. One round landed short, another overshot, another detonated harmlessly in the fog. Inside the lead tank, Sergeant Frank Delaney wiped sweat from his forehead, squinting through the periscope. "Feels like driving through milk," he muttered. Wilson's voice came over the intercom. "Keep straight. If you lose sight, listen for the next engine." The escape route, a narrow corridor between two ridges, partially shielded by a burned-out orchard, was less than a mile wide. But every inch had to be covered under fire, with no way to navigate except by instinct and compass. Minutes stretched into centuries. Every clank of a track, every distant shout became amplified by the smoke. A single wrong turn could send them straight into German lines. Yet the smoke's chaotic drift worked in their favor. It spread unevenly, confusing both attackers and defenders. For the Germans, the sight was incomprehensible. Through binoculars, it looked as if the valley itself had come alive, rolling and twisting with sentient fog. Machine gun teams, positioned along the northern ridge, fired bursts in panic, striking their own advancing troops. Radio chatter turned to shouting. "Enemy retreating west," one voice reported. "No, they're advancing north," replied another. The fog made distance meaningless. Echoes distorted every sound. Wilson's plan had turned the battlefield into an illusionist's trick, one in which perception collapsed before reality. As the column moved, Wilson's tank struck the edge of a shallow crater. The treads ground against the slope, sparks flashing. The tank lurched sideways, almost rolling. Delaney shouted a warning, but the driver corrected in time, stabilizing. Behind them, the second Sherman adjusted course, keeping formation by sound alone. Then came the real test. The smoke began thinning. Their fuel for the dischargers was nearly spent. If the Germans regained visibility too soon, the entire maneuver would collapse. Wilson knew this and prepared the final stage. He ordered his artillery officer, Lieutenant Nash, to detonate all remaining smoke grenades manually at intervals along their trail, maintaining the illusion of density. Nash, carrying a small satchel of grenades, ran back through the fog, dropping and pulling pins as he went. Each burst renewed the wall, layering new sheets of cover. The man disappeared into the haze like a phantom, his task essential to everyone's survival. By 0645, the lead tanks reached the orchard line, the edge of the trap. Beyond it lay open ground, still dangerous but free of the immediate German ring. Wilson signaled halt, then waited, counting seconds, listening for the unmistakable thrum of the rearmost vehicle. One by one, muffled engine sounds confirmed they were intact. He exhaled for the first time in hours. Behind them, the valley still burned with confusion. To the Germans, the pocket was silent. No movement, no resistance. They believed they had destroyed another isolated detachment. In reality, the smoke was still alive, concealing the impossible. The fog of smoke hung low over the valley, thick enough to blind, heavy enough to taste. Every breath carried the tang of burning canisters and diesel. From within, the three encircled. Units advanced, each movement measured, silent, disciplined. They moved like ghosts, guided only by the subtle vibration of engines, the sound of treads in mud, and whispered commands filtered through intercoms. German forces, disoriented by the reversed smoke, fired blindly. Tracers flashed like erratic fireflies, striking the earth or ricocheting harmlessly off hedgerows. Artillery rounds that should have shattered the escape route detonated too far or too short. The valley's contours, once an enemy advantage, now amplified confusion. Shells bounced along ridges, creating smoke and dust that merged seamlessly with the man-made veil. Major Wilson's heart pounded, yet his face remained calm. Every second counted. One misstep, a tank slipping in mud, a misread signal, and the carefully orchestrated illusion could collapse. Behind him, the second and third units advanced. In tight formation, infantry clinging to tank hulls, medics balancing stretchers over uneven ground. Each man trusted instinct and experience, synchronized with the rhythm of machine and terrain. The first obstacle appeared, a destroyed bridge across a shallow stream, its twisted beams blocking the only clear path. The Sherman driver adjusted, angling the tank carefully, while engineers ran ahead to drop makeshift ramps. Smoke curled over them, hiding the labor from prying German eyes. A burst of machine gun fire struck the bank nearby, ricocheting metal sparks into the fog. The men held their positions, motionless, letting the mist conceal their presence. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into minutes. The Germans called in flares, hoping to pierce the thickening smoke. But each flare illuminated only a swirling wall of white, reflecting light back into their optics. The valley, once a trap, now became an invisible corridor. Wilson's gamble, the backwards smoke device, had transformed terrain and weather into allies. By 07:15, the lead Sherman reached the first ridge. Beyond it lay open ground, riskier but critical. From this vantage point, Wilson could see faint shadows, German armored units realigning to intercept, unaware of the exact movement beneath the smoke. He signaled the column forward, each tank accelerating cautiously, treads churning mud into clouds that merged seamlessly with the smoke barrier. Infantry advanced alongside tanks, using the vehicles as shields while navigating the faintly illuminated ridge. Medic teams, carrying wounded, moved silently, shadows among shadows. One soldier, Private Dorman, whispered, "Feels like we're walking through clouds." It was true. Visibility rarely exceeded a few meters, yet coordination remained impeccable. Then came the valley's narrowest point, a constricted lane flanked by German positions on both sides. Any misalignment here would be fatal. Wilson's voice cut through the intercom. "Hold formation. 1 meter gap. Move when ready." The column waited, tension coiling tight as the fog seemed to pulse around them. At the signal, they surged forward. Smoke boiled outward and back, confusing rangefinders, while the Sherman's engines masked infantry movement. German gunners fired in bursts, but shells struck only the obscured earth or ricocheted off hedgerows. The illusion worked perfectly. The enemy could not distinguish friend from foe, nor could they predict speed or direction. Minutes later, the first units emerged from the smoke onto relatively open terrain. Sunlight caught their outlines briefly, but by now, the rear Sherman had ignited a final salvo of smoke grenades along the valley floor. This trailing veil preserved the corridor, masking every advancing soldier and vehicle. The units moved as one, an almost silent river flowing toward Allied lines. By 07:30, they had reached the edge of friendly territory. Allied forces, initially unaware of the breakout, stared in amazement as soldiers and tanks appeared seemingly from nowhere. No unit had been lost to direct fire. Casualties were minimal, a testament to planning, coordination, and the audacious ingenuity of Wilson's adjustment. Once clear, men collapsed briefly, gasping, mud-smeared and exhausted. The fog lingered, behind them, still curling over the ridges and valley floor, giving the illusion that the pocket remained trapped. To the Germans, the area appeared empty, as if the Allied units had vanished entirely, an escape bordering on the impossible. The psychological impact was profound. Wilson's subordinates realized that survival was not always about brute force. It was about perception, timing, and clever use of the environment. The smoke had done more than conceal. It had deceived, disrupted, and ultimately dictated the enemy's response. The laughter of his men from the previous night, mocking the backward smoke device, now became quiet, awed respect. By mid-morning, reports reached higher command. 3 units had escaped encirclement with minimal losses, thanks to a single tactical innovation. The Germans, reviewing their post-engagement assessments, struggled to explain the disappearance. Artillery and tank crews were left questioning their observations, certain that some unseen force had turned the valley against them. Wilson allowed himself a rare smile, acknowledging the risk had paid off. He knew the escape would be recounted as absurd, daring, and impossible. But within the valley, in the interplay of smoke, sound, and terrain, every calculation had been precise. A blend of intuition, engineering, and courage. And for those 3 units, the story of the backwards smoke device would become legend. A reminder that audacity, combined with understanding of both machine and battlefield, could turn the most hopeless entrapment into survival. The moment the last Sherman crossed into friendly territory, relief rippled through the surviving units. What had been a precarious, almost hopeless position became a case study in ingenuity and leadership under pressure. Commanders at divisional headquarters struggled to reconcile reports with maps. According to official logs, 3 full units had vanished from an encirclement zone that, by all conventional calculation, should have decimated them. Yet there they were, intact, disciplined, and ready to fight again. The immediate tactical consequences were striking. The Germans, who had assumed the valley contained trapped units ripe for destruction, were forced to redirect forces in confusion. Some of their artillery, previously calibrated to sweep the pocket, now overshot, striking empty ground or even their own positions. Observation posts had been misled, causing misallocation of armor and infantry. The fog created by Wilson's backwards smoke device had done more than conceal movement. It had sown chaos in the enemy's command and control network. Within Allied ranks, the escape became a symbol of both courage and adaptive thinking. Men who had laughed at the device the night before now recognized its ingenuity. Engineers documented the modifications for study, noting the critical interaction between terrain, wind currents, and launcher angles. The Sherman, once seen as a predictable platform, was now an instrument of tactical creativity, demonstrating how minor adjustments could dramatically influence engagement outcomes. The human element was equally significant. Wilson's calm, analytical leadership had transformed fear into purposeful action. His crew followed precise routines, relying on instinct and coordination rather than raw orders. Soldiers reported that the successful maneuver reinforced trust in leadership and confidence in improvisation. Those who had doubted the feasibility of a backward smoke device learned that adaptability and observation often outweigh strict adherence to doctrine. The escape also highlighted limitations in standard Allied equipment and tactics. Conventional smoke deployment relied on outward projection to mask forward advances. In the unique microclimate of the valley, these methods would have failed. By reversing the angle and using terrain-induced airflow, Wilson's team effectively turned an operational vulnerability into a strategic advantage. Technical analysts later noted that this incident prompted discussions about adjusting smoke projector designs and tactics to accommodate complex terrain. Psychologically, the event sent ripples through both sides. For Allied troops, it was proof that ingenuity could bridge the gap between disadvantage and survival. For the Germans, it was a stark reminder that numerical superiority and well-drilled formations could be nullified by unexpected tactics. Officers recorded frustration in after-action reports, noting that the fog's origin and behavior defied prediction and made conventional targeting unreliable. The escape though minor in scale compared to larger campaigns, had disproportional effects on morale and decision-making. Wilson himself downplayed the heroics. In later interviews, he described the maneuver as a calculated risk, nothing more, emphasizing that any slight misjudgment could have led to disaster. Yet the broader military community recognized its brilliance. The successful use of environmental manipulation, combined with rapid field modification of equipment, showcased the potential of adaptive problem-solving in live combat scenarios. Beyond immediate military outcomes, the episode influenced unit culture. Soldiers began to share ideas for subtle equipment adjustments, experiment with unconventional use of standard gear, and value critical observation over strict procedure. The legend of the backwards smoke device became a teaching tool, a reminder that creativity in warfare, when disciplined and precisely executed, could save lives and turn the tide of small but crucial engagements. By the end of the day, the three escaped units had regrouped, repaired minor damages, and re-established communication with divisional command. Reports circulated of enemy units misallocating resources and failing to regain momentum in the area. The incident was more than an escape. It was a demonstration of how terrain, improvisation, and leadership could intersect to create outcomes that manuals alone could never predict. The valley, once a trap, had become a testament to human ingenuity. The fog lingered as a silent witness, a white curtain that had hidden movement deceived the enemy, and allowed three units to survive against overwhelming odds. In the days following the escape, military analysts began piecing together how three isolated units had slipped past German encirclement with minimal casualties. The key factor, repeatedly cited in reports, was the unusual deployment of smoke, reversed and adapted to the terrain's microclimate. Field officers emphasized that the innovation was not simply a mechanical tweak, but a tactical reimagining that combined observation, timing, and human coordination. The Germans, for their part, were forced to reconsider their assumptions about Allied behavior. Experienced observers who had relied on standard patterns of smoke deployment now questioned everything. Post-war memoirs from German officers described frustration and disbelief. Smoke seemed to move backward, conceal movement, and create phantom forces in the fog. The psychological disruption lasted longer than the material effects, as commanders hesitated to commit troops to engagements that might be illusory. Allied units, inspired by Wilson's audacity, began experimenting with small modifications in smoke deployment. Training manuals were updated with annotations describing how terrain and wind currents could be leveraged to maximize concealment. Officers encouraged creative problem-solving on the battlefield, understanding that rigid adherence to doctrine might be fatal in complex terrain. The episode became a textbook example in armored tactics courses, illustrating how innovation could amplify modest resources under pressure. Wilson's personal reputation grew quietly. He received formal commendations from divisional command, though he remained modest, emphasizing the collective effort of his engineers, gunners, and infantry. He described the maneuver as simple adjustments, nothing miraculous. Yet contemporaries recognized the combination of foresight, calm decision-making, and technical understanding required to execute it successfully under life-threatening conditions. The backwards smoke device also influenced Allied tactical culture beyond the immediate theater. Commanders began encouraging adaptive thinking in small unit operations, particularly in situations involving constrained terrain, ambush potential, or supply limitations. The incident highlighted a recurring truth of warfare. Innovation often stems from necessity, and success depends on the integration of human ingenuity with mechanical capability. In the immediate aftermath, the surviving units were redeployed to support ongoing advances in Normandy. Soldiers carried with them an unusual confidence. They had faced near-total annihilation, and yet, through a combination of creativity and discipline, had emerged intact. This morale boost, though intangible, contributed to cohesion and effectiveness in subsequent operations, a subtle but critical factor in the broader campaign. Technical studies conducted later revealed the precise mechanics of the reversed smoke effect. By angling canisters inward and downward, the smoke settled along the valley floor, enveloping the advancing units while obscuring lines of sight from higher elevations. The combination of terrain-induced airflow and carefully timed detonation allowed the fog to persist longer than standard screens, creating both a physical and psychological barrier. This empirical understanding informed future tactical manuals, particularly for armored and infantry coordination in constrained or obscured environments. The Germans, meanwhile, eventually realized the Allied forces had escaped entirely. Reconnaissance confirmed empty positions, and artillery recalibrations failed to locate the retreating troops. In the chaos, German units expended resources correcting for errors that had never truly existed, a vivid illustration of how perception can dictate operational decision-making as much as reality. By the end of August, the tale of the 3 escaped units circulated among Allied ranks, first in whispers, then in reports and official documentation. Soldiers who had witnessed it firsthand recounted the backward smoke device with awe, noting not only the tactical brilliance, but also the leadership and trust that made such a risky maneuver possible. Laughter, once a reaction of disbelief, had transformed into respect, a shared acknowledgement that unconventional thinking could produce extraordinary results. In retrospect, the episode exemplified the intersection of innovation, terrain mastery, and human psychology in modern warfare. Small adjustments, executed with precision and confidence, had disrupted a superior force and allowed survival against overwhelming odds. The story would endure in military studies, in memoirs, and in the collective memory of those who served, symbolizing the power of imagination under pressure. The smoke that had curled through the valley remained as a metaphor for ingenuity, courage, and the quiet brilliance that can turn an almost certain defeat into a lasting victory. War often magnifies the smallest choices. A single decision, a subtle adjustment, can ripple through the chaos of battle and alter the course of lives. Major Wilson's backward smoke device was not a grand invention, nor a weapon of mass destruction. It was a quiet act of ingenuity born from desperation, observation, and trust in human skill. In the valley near Falaise, 3 units survived what should have been annihilation. The smoke did more than conceal movement. It challenged assumptions, reshaped perception, and forced the enemy to confront uncertainty in real time. Soldiers learned that the battlefield is as much a theater of mind as of firepower, and that courage often requires both daring and creativity. The event left enduring lessons. Commanders studied it to understand how innovation could multiply limited resources. Engineers and tacticians considered how small modifications to standard equipment might yield outsized effects. And, perhaps most importantly, it reminded everyone that laughter and skepticism can precede acts of brilliance. That sometimes what seems foolish in the moment becomes legend in hindsight. Beyond tactics, the story resonates on a human level. Fear, fatigue, and confusion do not vanish in war, but they can be harnessed, directed, and transformed into purposeful action. Wilson's calm leadership, his trust in his men and machines, created an environment where ingenuity could thrive. The soldiers' survival was as much a triumph of human adaptability as of mechanical or chemical physics. As the smoke lifted over the valley that August morning, it left more than visibility restored. It left an imprint of possibility. Even in situations that appear hopeless, careful observation, courageous action, and creative thinking can carve paths through danger. The valley remained scarred, but within those scars lay a story of audacity and ingenuity. A story that continues to inspire, reminding us that sometimes survival is achieved not through brute strength, but through insight, timing, and the quiet brilliance of one mind daring to think differently. And in that quiet brilliance, 3 units escaped, a small miracle forged in smoke. Mud and human resolve,